If the greatest monuments on Earth are hiding anything, it's probably not above us, it's below. When people stand in front of great monuments, they almost always do the same thing. They look up. They look at the domes, the columns, the giant faces carved into stone, the sharp lines rising toward the sky, the weathered arches that have outlived empires. They stare at the scale of it all, how massive it is, how old it feels, how strangely inhuman it can seem. We do this in front of the pyramids. We do it in front of Hagia Sophia, in front of St. Peter's Basilica, at Teotihuacan, in Rome, in Istanbul, in Mexico, everywhere. No matter where we are, the monument tells us to do the same thing. Look up. And maybe that's exactly why we miss the real story. Because some structures do not only rise, some structures cover, some hide. Some appear powerful precisely because they silence another world beneath them. When you stand in front of a monument, you are not just looking at stone. You are looking at the way a civilization wanted to present itself. But under every official story, there is another layer, the layer that was not meant to be seen. Some monuments erase that layer, some bury it, some leave it below ground, silent, invisible, but never completely gone. And that is why this question is heavier than it sounds. What lies beneath the world's greatest monuments? That is not just an archaeological question. It's a question about memory, about power, about sacred space, about what one civilization does to the one that came before it. Because humanity rarely built its greatest monuments on empty ground. Again and again, the biggest structures were placed on land that was already carrying meaning. On top of tombs, on top of older sacred sites, on top of forgotten roads, on top of earlier walls, on top of previous belief systems, on top of caves, tunnels, necropolises, underground chambers, and sometimes ritual centers far older than the structure now visible above them. In other words, if you want to understand a monument, it is not enough to ask how high it rises. You also have to ask what it is standing on. Because sometimes the true weight of a monument does not come from its own stone. It comes from the silence buried underneath it. So stop for a second and really think about that. Why did humanity keep placing its greatest, most sacred, most permanent structures on top of older layers? Why was empty ground not enough? Why was the surface never enough? Why was there always something below? Maybe the answer begins with a very old human instinct, because people never treated thresholds as ordinary things. Doors, gateways, stairways descending underground, city gates, temple entrances, tomb openings, cave mouths, ceremonial roads, hidden corridors. None of these were ever just practical openings. They were places where states changed. They were lines between one world and another, between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the ordinary, between inside and outside, between safety and uncertainty. In ancient Rome, Janus was the god of gates, beginnings, transitions, and thresholds. He had two faces, one looking to the past, the other to the future. That is not just a beautiful mythological detail. That is exactly what a threshold is. The thing behind you and the thing ahead of you exist at the same time. In Mesopotamia, city gates were never just for defense. The Ishtar Gate in Babylon announced that what lay beyond it was not merely another part of the city, it was a different order of reality. In Persia, monumental gates turned power into architecture. In ancient Egypt, Tombs and temples were designed around the idea that life and death were separated by structured passage. In Greek thought, even dreams had gates, one for truth, one for deception. In medieval Europe, city gates did not only keep enemies out, they marked the closing of time itself. And in Islamic cities, monumental portals did not merely lead into another courtyard, they carried you into another rhythm, another gravity, another form of life. All of this points to one idea. For human beings, the greatest transitions were always connected to something unseen. And maybe that is why great monuments are never just structures rising upward. They are structures anchored to meanings below. The underside of a monument is rarely just empty space. Very often, it is a second narrative. So let's test that idea against one of the oldest and most famous monuments on Earth, Giza. When most people stand in front of the Great Pyramid, what they see is geometry, precision, human stubbornness transformed into stone, a shape so exact and so immense that it feels almost natural, like a mountain someone somehow built. But the most unsettling thing about the pyramid is not just how high it rises. It's that once you enter it, you also feel the pull downward. Inside the Great Pyramid, there are upper passages, chambers, ascending routes, but also a darker architectural logic reaching below. Because in ancient Egypt, death was not simply an ending, it was a passage, a transition into another state of existence. So one of the greatest monuments ever built was already working in two directions at once. From the outside, it rises toward the heavens. Inside, it draws you into the earth. One face turned to the stars, another turned downward. That does not feel accidental, because here we meet the first major pattern. The greatest monuments are rarely empty underneath. Why? Because below was never just below. Below was transition. Below was transformation. Below was hidden weight. And maybe monuments needed that hidden weight in order to feel truly monumental. This becomes even clearer when you look at Egyptian funerary logic as a whole. For the Egyptians, the dead did not simply vanish into darkness. They moved through a system, through gates, through guarded passages, through thresholds that required knowledge, names, permission, and order. So the inner design of a monument like the Great Pyramid may not just be about protecting a body. It may also reflect a far older obsession with directed passage, narrow corridors, rising galleries, sealed chambers, blind endings, lower spaces cut into rock. To a modern tourist, these may seem like strange engineering choices, but to an ancient mind, they could have formed part of a ritual geography, one that linked the visible monument to an invisible journey. And when you step back from the pyramid itself, the pattern widens. Because Giza is not just one giant stone form on an empty plateau, it is a whole mortuary world. Causeways, valley temples, burial complexes, satellite structures, solar boats, tomb fields. So even here, in one of the most iconic sites on Earth, the visible monument is only the upper layer of a much larger system. A system built around passage, burial, alignment, and the management of the unseen. Now let's leave Egypt and move to another continent, Teotihuacan. Today, most people think of Teotihuacan as a city of pyramids, long ceremonial avenues, and impossible urban order. But one of its most disturbing discoveries was not made on the surface. It was made below it. First, there was a depression, then a shaft, then a passage reaching underground, and then, beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, archaeologists uncovered a tunnel that had been intentionally sealed for centuries. This was not just an empty cavity, it was a designed underworld. Inside were ritual objects, animal remains, statues, reflective stones, symbolic materials. Things that felt less like storage and more like communication, as if the space below had been built as a threshold between the human world and something else. And the most disturbing part was not that someone had made this place, it was that someone had closed it. Really think about that. You dig a passage beneath a sacred monument, you fill it with symbolic meaning, and then you seal it. So the issue is not simply that something existed below, it is that someone decided it should remain hidden. That is a huge idea, because what lies beneath the monument is not just a void, it is concealed intention. Something was placed below, then covered, then the world above continued as if the lower layer no longer mattered. This may be one of the strangest recurring human behaviors around great monuments, not destroying the earlier world, but silencing it, not erasing it, but forcing it beneath the surface, then building a new order above it. And Teotihuacan is especially powerful because the underground here does not feel secondary, it feels central. Some scholars have linked such spaces to water, fertility, rulership, cosmic origins, or sacred geography. That means the tunnel is not just beneath the structure, it may be part of what gives the structure meaning in the first place. The monument above does not merely stand over empty ground, it stands over a hidden center. Now let's widen the frame again, because the feeling that something below matters is not unique to Egypt or Mesoamerica. You find it across the ancient world. In Greece, Delphi offers one of the clearest examples. Most people remember Delphi as a sanctuary on a mountainside, columns, terraces, treasure houses, a temple, a famous oracle. But the deepest idea at Delphi is not the surface arrangement. It is the break beneath it. According to Greek myth, before Apollo claimed Delphi, the place belonged to an older, darker force, Python, the serpent or dragon associated with the site. Apollo defeats Python and takes the sanctuary. That is not just a myth of conquest, it is a myth of replacement. A new sacred order is established on top of an older one. A new god claims a previous center. And that is exactly the pattern we keep seeing. The visible temple is never the whole story. The sacredness of Delphi was never just about the stones above ground. It was tied to what was imagined below, a rupture, a source, a hidden point of contact between worlds. The oracle itself deepens this feeling. Where did the voice come from? From a crack? From vapors? From the earth? From the god? From a chamber? From a place below language? Later people argued over the mechanics, reinterpreted them, even rejected parts of the older story. But the important thing is that, in the ancient mind, the great sanctuary was not separate from the hidden place beneath it. The power above depended on a mystery below. And this may be one of the oldest architectural truths humanity ever lived by. The visible center is strongest when it is attached to an invisible source. That same instinct appears again and again across Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean. Sacred places are often associated with caves, springs, cracks in rock, underground chambers, and the remains of previous cults. Because to ancient people, the underworld was never just darkness. It was origin, memory, the place from which power rose and to which ritual returned. That is why surface monuments and underground structures so often belong to the same sacred logic. One is meant to be seen, the other is meant to be felt. Now let's return to Mesoamerica again, but with a different example, Chichen Itza. Most people know the Pyramid of Kukulkan for its step geometry and the dramatic play of light and shadow during the equinox, when a serpent seems to descend its staircase. But the structure we see today is not the whole structure. Inside it is an older pyramid, and beneath it lies a geological and symbolic world shaped by sinkholes, underground water, and the sacred logic of cenotes. This matters because it shows, once again, that major monuments are not always single creations. They are layers. What we see on the outside may be one phase, inside it another, underneath it another world entirely. And that completely changes how the monument feels, because then it is no longer just a building, it is compressed time, a visible shell around earlier forms, a structure sitting above water, darkness, depth, and cosmological significance. And once you begin noticing this pattern, you see it elsewhere too. Take Cholula. From a distance, the Great Pyramid of Cholula looks like a hill. So much earth and vegetation cover it that it can appear almost natural. But it is not natural. It is human-made, layered, and internally complex. Worse, or perhaps more revealing, is what happened later. A church was built on top of it. That one image contains the whole logic of this video, an older sacred structure covered by time and earth, then overtaken by a newer sacred order, a new religion placed visibly above the old. This is not simple destruction, it is more complicated than that. The older sacred center is not gone, it remains below. The newer one gains part of its power by occupying the exact same point. That is a very human move, not just to eliminate the old center, but to inherit it, to absorb its gravity, to stand where it stood and say, "This belongs to us now." That is what makes great monuments feel haunted, not in the cheap supernatural sense, in the historical sense. They are often haunted by the worlds beneath them. Now we have to go to Jerusalem, because there may be no place on earth where the tension between surface and buried meaning feels more intense. The Temple Mount, the Western Wall area, the tunnels, the buried roads, the older retaining walls, the repeated building, destruction, rebuilding, sanctification, and contest. In Jerusalem, nothing is just stone. Everything is claim. Everything is memory. Everything is a layered argument over what this place means and who gets to define it. And just like everywhere else, the same question returns. Why is the same point reclaimed again and again? Why does one center continue attracting new structures, new rituals, new meanings? Why do successive civilizations keep returning to the same ground? Because some places are not just places, they are concentrated fields of meaning. And great monuments are often placed on top of those fields, not because the ground is empty, but because it is already unbearably full. This matters far beyond Jerusalem, because once you realize that monuments are often built on top of older centers, the whole logic of civilization changes. A monument is no longer just a beginning. It is often a takeover, a continuation, a conversion, an enclosure, a sealing over, a declaration that the new order now stands where the old one once spoke. And that brings us to one of the most unsettling examples in the Christian world, St. Peter's Basilica. Above ground, it is one of the most famous religious structures on earth, massive, radiant, ceremonial, official. But beneath it lies a necropolis, roads, tombs, burial space, the geography of death. Think about the symbolic force of that. Above, one of the greatest monuments of Christianity. Below, the world of graves. Above, light. Below, burial. Above, continuity. Below, mortality. This is not just practical layering, it is meaning layered onto meaning. A new sacred order rises over an older geography of death, but it does not erase it, it absorbs it. And that may be exactly what gives it so much weight. Because maybe monumental power does not come only from what a structure shows. Maybe it also comes from what it silently holds down beneath it. Now we have to return to Istanbul, because Hagia Sophia may be one of the most perfect examples of everything we've been talking about. Most people approach Hagia Sophia through the familiar language of empires: Byzantine Christianity, imperial power, conquest, conversion, restoration, identity, a skyline, a dome. But once again, the lower layers change the whole emotional texture of the building. Around and beneath Hagia Sophia, researchers have documented tunnels, channels, voids, and deeper structural layers. Some of this is explained in straightforward technical terms: water management, ventilation, service systems, maintenance-related access. But the reason the feeling does not disappear is simple. In a city like Istanbul, nothing below ground ever feels only technical. Everything below ground feels historical, because the city itself is historical in layers. Roman influence, Byzantine order, Ottoman reuse, modern infrastructure, buried streets, subterranean cisterns, former burial logic, lost movement patterns. So when you look at the understructure of a monument like Hagia Sophia, you are not just looking at engineering, you are looking at compressed civilization. And that creates a very different feeling than just hearing, "There are tunnels below." The question becomes, if even the most iconic monuments rest on top of hidden systems, older voids or buried worlds, what exactly are monuments doing? Are they just marks of greatness? Or are they ways of fixing new authority above older, deeper realities? And now the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In Giza, meaning descends below the visible monument. In Teotihuacan, a ritual tunnel is sealed under a sacred structure. At Delphi, sacred power depends on what lies beneath the visible sanctuary. At Chichen Itza, the monument is layered over older monuments and deeper cosmological geography. At Cholula, one sacred order stands on top of another. In Jerusalem, centrality is repeatedly claimed through the same loaded ground. At St. Peter's, the monument stands over death. At Hagia Sophia, the surface cannot be separated from the hidden infrastructure of history below. These are not just interesting examples anymore. This is a behavior pattern. Humanity keeps building its greatest monuments on top of older layers. So why? Why does empty ground seem insufficient? Why does greatness keep choosing burdened ground? Why is the underside of a monument so often full of death, passage, water, ritual, or earlier sacred meaning? Maybe because power wants continuity. Maybe because new orders look stronger when they inherit old centers. Maybe because sacredness is easier to claim than to create from nothing. Maybe because buried worlds still radiate authority. Or maybe because human beings have always sensed something else, that true centrality requires depth, not just height, depth. And maybe that is the key. We are trained to think monumentality is vertical. The higher the dome, the taller the pyramid, the grander the facade, the greater the structure. But what if monumentality is not only vertical? What if it is vertical in both directions? What if the structures that impress us most are not just the ones that rise highest, but the ones that anchor deepest? What if their greatness comes not just from how far they reach into the sky, but from how much buried time they pin beneath them. That would explain a lot. It would explain why monuments placed on historically dense ground feel so much heavier than monuments placed in empty landscapes. It would explain why civilizations keep returning to the same sacred points. It would explain why new religious and political orders so often build over older structures rather than elsewhere. It would explain why the most visible places on Earth often sit over the least visible stories. And it would explain the unease. Because once you understand that monuments may be strongest where memory is most compressed, they stop feeling clean. They stop feeling like single statements. They become accumulations, concealments, settlements with the past. The visible structure becomes the latest sentence written over an older text. And sometimes, if you know how to look, you can still see the earlier writing beneath it. That changes the emotional experience of looking at them. A pyramid is no longer just a pyramid. A temple is no longer just a temple. A basilica is no longer just a basilica. A great monument is no longer just a masterpiece of its own period. It becomes a lid, a seal, a visible order laid over invisible gravity. And the real question shifts. It is no longer just, who built this? It becomes, what did they build it over? What had to be buried? What had to be inherited? What had to be kept below the surface in order for this structure to feel inevitable? And once you start asking that, another thought appears, one that is much harder to shake. Maybe some of the greatest monuments in the world are not merely celebrating what stands above ground. Maybe they are also managing what remains below it. Not necessarily hiding in some dramatic, conspiratorial sense, but organizing, containing, claiming, reframing, turning buried worlds into foundations, turning previous sacredness into structural legitimacy, turning older silence into new power. And that is where the mystery becomes truly unsettling, because then monuments are not just achievements, they are negotiations with what came before, sometimes respectful, sometimes violent, sometimes strategic, sometimes devotional, but almost never innocent. Even when the explanations are practical, the pattern remains. Even when archaeology gives us clear answers, the deeper structure of the behavior is still there. Human beings keep doing this, building upward over older depths, which means the surface is rarely the full truth. And maybe that is what makes great monuments feel so strangely alive. Not because they contain magic, but because they compress too much time, too many worlds, too many claims, too much silence. This is also why I think monuments often produce a strange mix of awe and discomfort. Awe because they are beautiful, immense, and enduring. Discomfort because some part of us senses that they are not only telling us a story, they are controlling one, highlighting one layer, suppressing another, making one world visible, leaving another below. That is a powerful thing to realize, because it means that when we look at history's greatest monuments, we may not actually be looking at complete objects. We may be looking at visible decisions made on top of invisible inheritances. And if that is true, then the official identity of any great monument is only the uppermost layer of what it really is. The rest remains below, buried but not gone, silent but not powerless, invisible but still shaping what rises above it. And this leads to a final, deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if the monuments that feel most timeless do not feel timeless because they stand alone? What if they feel timeless because they are sitting on top of so many dead times at once? One age beneath another, one belief beneath another, one city beneath another, one burial beneath another monument, one sacred story pressed beneath the next. In that case, the monument is not just a triumph over time, it is a stack of conquered times. And the stone above us is only the part we were meant to see. Once that idea gets into your head, it becomes very hard to look at major monuments the same way again. The dome is still beautiful. The column is still beautiful. The facade is still beautiful. But now you know beauty may be the surface of compression. You know magnificence may sit over burial. You know official memory may sit over earlier memory. You know the structure above may depend on the silence below. And once you see that, the monument changes. Or maybe not the monument, maybe you change. Maybe you stop being satisfied by the surface. Maybe you stop trusting what is immediately visible. Maybe you begin to suspect that every truly great structure has two stories. The story it tells above ground and the story it keeps below. So the next time you stand in front of one of the world's greatest monuments, do not just look up, look down too. Ask what lies beneath the paving, ask what is under the foundations, ask what older road, older tomb, older chamber, older belief, older city, older silence might still be there, pressed beneath the monument but not erased by it. Because maybe some monuments were not built only to rise. Maybe they were also built to hold something down. And if humanity really has spent thousands of years placing its greatest structures on top of buried worlds, then what exactly was down there? And maybe the even stranger question is this: when we stand in awe before history's greatest monuments, are we really responding to the structures themselves? Or are we feeling the gravity of everything buried underneath them?